Long before the season heated up, so did the attacks. Veterans like Io Wilson and others began stirring the pot with comments that hinted at instability within the Indiana Fever, all without stepping foot in their locker room. Sydney Colson had seen enough. Her response was direct. None of it was true. From team dinners to injury rehab, she painted a picture of a roster more united than ever. Colson's calm but powerful rebuttal dismantled the narrative brick by brick.
If you're here for the real story and not the filtered version, subscribe. And if you're sticking around for the next meltdown, you better definitely subscribe.
Proving that the Fever's cohesion wasn't performative, it was personal. This wasn't about silencing critics, it was about telling the full story. Colson's words became a mirror, reflecting a team that thrives on resilience, honesty, and real connection. Every fabricated headline only made the group stronger. With Colson guiding through adversity and players like Caitlin Clark growing in confidence, Indiana showed what happens when false narratives collapse. The truth shines through, and the team that was doubted stands taller than ever. Sydney Colson just blew the lid off one of the most toxic, jealousy-fueled narratives to hit the WNBA this season, and she didn't hold back. From day one, the Indiana Fever and Caitlin Clark have been under relentless scrutiny. Before the team even had a chance to establish chemistry, outside voices were already pushing a story. That this locker room was divided, that veterans were clashing with rookies, and that the sudden rise of Clark was a destabilizing force in an otherwise balanced league. Sydney Colson said, "That's a lie." In a refreshingly honest account, she laid out exactly how this entire narrative was manufactured, from the timing of the attacks, to the veterans fueling the fire, to the media happily running with it for clicks. And make no mistake, this wasn't just gossip. This was an orchestrated effort to tear down the Fever's reputation before they ever got to prove who they really were. Colson called it what it is: jealousy. Not healthy competition, not basketball analysis. Jealousy. The kind that drives people to try to tear others down rather than rise to meet the moment. The kind that doesn't just show up after a loss or a heated game. It starts before the ball even tips. That's exactly what happened to Caitlin Clark. She entered the league with unprecedented attention. National spotlight, media deals, a fan base that followed her from Iowa and immediately turned every Fever game into a ratings event. And while some welcomed that energy, others clearly didn't. Veterans like Cheryl Swoops, Angel Reese, and Io Wilson made comments early and often, shading Clark, casting doubt on her influence, and doing their best to frame her presence as a problem. That's what makes Colson's testimony so powerful, because she wasn't watching this play out from the outside. She was inside the Fever organization, on the roster, in a locker room. She lived through the narrative in real time, and she's saying it never matched reality. According to Colson, the Indiana Fever were not fractured. They weren't tiptoeing around Clark's presence. There were no hushed arguments, no side-eye tension, no drama bubbling beneath the surface. The chemistry was solid, the leadership was shared, and the bonding? Completely organic. She broke it down. The players clicked early on. Off the court, they bonded through dinners, downtime, and shared experiences. Not because of PR obligations or forced team building, but because they liked each other. They respected each other. That trust translated directly into improved performance on the court. And it only grew stronger as the season progressed. The media's version of events didn't even come close. Because while outlets were pushing headlines about dysfunction and tension, what was actually happening was growth. Players adapting to new roles. Rookies learning the league. Veterans offering guidance. All of it within a supportive, open, and genuinely united environment. Colson also opened up about how adversity tested that unity and made it stronger. When injuries started hitting the roster, it would have been easy for things to break down. But that's not what happened. When Colson herself got hurt, the team didn't distance themselves. They rallied, checked in, showed up. Her injury became a moment that revealed the true character of the team. The bonds weren't performative. They were real. And she didn't disappear into rehab quietly, either. Colson continued leading through presence, communication, and mentorship. That's the kind of veteran leadership that actually matters. Not passive-aggressive quotes to the media. Not ego-driven shots from the sidelines. But showing up for your team, even when you're not in uniform. Her example directly contradicted the narrative that veteran influence was creating a toxic environment in Indiana. It wasn't. And if anything, it proved that authentic leadership still exists in this league. It's just being drowned out by the louder, more bitter voices. And let's be real, those louder voices knew exactly what they were doing. Colson exposed how the criticism aimed at Clark and the Fever wasn't about strategy or stats. It was about control. There were people who saw the spotlight shifting, and instead of adjusting to the new reality, they lashed out. They used their platforms to paint a false picture, hoping to stir doubt and distract from the fact that the league needs new stars to grow. The media latched onto it immediately. One veteran throws shade, and suddenly there are talk shows speculating about locker room feuds. A single moment of silence during a timeout gets turned into a controversy. All of it built on thin air. No sources, no evidence, just envy, sensationalism, and people desperate to control the narrative. But Colson's honesty crushed all of that. She made it clear, the Indiana Fever aren't being torn apart from the inside. They're building something, a real culture, a sustainable one, based on mutual respect, shared effort, and authentic connection. That's what sets them apart. While the rest of the league was busy creating noise, the Fever were creating chemistry. Not every team has that. Not every team can handle pressure and still move forward in sync. But they did. And it's a big part of why they're positioned for long-term success. This isn't just about defending Clark. It's about telling the truth about a team that has been misrepresented at every turn. Colson reminded everyone that leadership isn't loud, it's consistent. That growth doesn't happen in perfect conditions. It happens in the middle of chaos, when people choose to trust each other anyway. And that jealousy doesn't build legacies, it erodes them. She also made something else very clear. Caitlin Clark didn't ask for special treatment. She didn't walk into the locker room with demands. She worked, she listened, she adjusted, and she did it all while carrying a spotlight bigger than most rookies could imagine. The people pushing these narratives, they weren't talking from experience. They were reacting to attention they didn't like. Colson was talking from the inside, and her words should be the final word on the matter. The story being told about the Fever, it was never real. It was projection, fueled by envy and repeated by media that cared more about clicks than credibility. But now that the truth is out, it's time to move on. Because this team is. They're moving forward, focused, and more unified than ever. With veterans like Colson setting the tone, younger stars stepping up, and a culture rooted in trust, not ego, Indiana is no longer just a headline. They're a warning. That manufactured narratives only go so far. That truth eventually breaks through. And that no amount of jealousy can undo what's actually happening inside that locker room. So if you're still clinging to the idea that the Fever are divided, let it go. If you've been following the critics, it's time to listen to the people who are actually in the building. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Were these narratives always about fear of change? Do you think the media owes Indiana an apology? And has Colson's honesty finally shifted the conversation back to where it belongs? Like this if you're here for real voices. Share it with someone who still believes the drama. And subscribe to stay locked in, because the truth always hits different when it comes straight from the source. Let's be clear, what Colson exposed wasn't just about one team. This was a reality check for the entire WNBA. A hard, necessary look at how narratives are shaped not by facts, but by fear. Fear of change, fear of losing status, fear of the next generation rising faster, louder, and with more eyes on them than ever before. And who better to deliver that message than a veteran who's actually been inside the locker room? Colson has the receipts. She's lived through the dynamics that so many outsiders pretended to understand. And what she laid out dismantled months of gossip in a matter of minutes. She wasn't vague about it either. She called out the timing of the smear campaign, how the criticism didn't come after bad losses or chemistry issues, but before Caitlin Clark even debuted. That's not reaction, that's strategy. Certain players had already made up their minds, and the goal was simple: poison the public perception before the Fever had a chance to control their own story. And let's not act like we didn't see it happen in real time. The moment Clark entered the league, the whispers started. She's not that good. She's not ready. She's changing the culture too fast. Then came the shade. Cheryl Swoops, questioning her credentials. Aya Wilson, sending cryptic messages about privilege. Angel Reese, jumping into the spotlight with carefully timed digs that seemed less about competition and more about disruption. But the difference between those voices and Sydney Colson, one of them actually had first-hand experience. That's what made her words hit so hard. This wasn't speculation. It was testimony, and it flew in the face of everything critics tried to make people believe. Colson laid out the real story, a team that wasn't divided but united, a team that didn't just tolerate each other but chose to bond, a team that was tested through adversity and came out stronger, not in theory but in action. She talked about how off-court relationships weren't staged. They weren't forced team-building activities. They were natural, organic, the product of shared experiences and mutual respect. Teammates spending time together, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. That's where real chemistry comes from. And then she brought up something the media conveniently ignored: the role injuries played in strengthening, not breaking, this team. When Colson herself got sidelined, that could have easily created distance. That's what usually happens on fractured teams. But with Indiana, it became a moment of closeness. Teammates checked in, stayed involved, made sure she was still part of the day-to-day vibe, even from the sideline. That support wasn't performative. It was foundational. She also didn't shy away from her own role as a veteran. Instead of throwing tantrums about changing media narratives or fighting for attention, she led quietly and consistently. Through mentorship, through presence, through resilience, she modeled what actual veteran leadership looks like. And it couldn't have come at a more crucial time. Because while some veterans used their status to plant doubt and fuel drama, Colson used hers to hold the culture together, to make sure the younger players knew what real support looked like, to show Caitlin Clark, who was carrying a national spotlight unlike anything the league's ever seen, that she wasn't alone. That kind of leadership doesn't trend on social media, but it matters. It defines what a locker room becomes. And that's exactly why Indiana never collapsed, no matter how hard the outside world tried to convince us they were on the verge. Colson's words made it clear. The so-called dysfunction wasn't internal. It was manufactured externally by people who felt threatened. And here's the truth no one wanted to say out loud. The rise of Caitlin Clark made a lot of veterans uncomfortable. Not because she wasn't good, but because she represented change. Visibility. Disruption of the old hierarchy. And rather than lean into the opportunity, some players chose to tear it down, one comment, one passive-aggressive post, one backhanded interview at a time. The media ate it up. They weren't looking for accuracy. They were looking for tension. And they found their scapegoat in Indiana. Every clipped interaction, every glance, every source who said there was trouble brewing, all of it was weaponized. Turned into narratives that didn't reflect the reality on the court or in the locker room. But now, thanks to Colson, that entire playbook has been exposed. She peeled it back, showed us where the cracks were, and they weren't inside the Fever. They were in the fragile egos of people who couldn't handle being outshined by a rookie with national buzz. People who thought gatekeeping was a strategy. People who confused status with relevance. And the best part? The Fever never stooped to that level. They didn't lash out publicly. They didn't clap back on socials. They just kept doing the work, kept showing up for each other, kept playing through the noise, kept building chemistry the old-fashioned way, with trust and consistency. Now, they've emerged from the storm not only intact, but stronger, more unified, and more focused than ever on what really matters: winning, growing, and doing it on their terms. Sydney Colson could have stayed quiet. She could have protected her peace, avoided the heat, and let the public keep guessing. But she didn't. She stepped up, not because she needed attention, but because her teammates deserved the truth. Her voice reclaimed the narrative. And in doing so, she gave every member of the Fever something invaluable: vindication. A reminder that their bond was real, that their growth wasn't fake, that their success didn't have to be filtered through anyone else's lens. The outside world tried to paint them as fragile. Colson showed they were forged, and now they're on a path to real dominance, built on genuine chemistry, veteran leadership, resilience, and a locker room culture that can't be shaken by outside noise anymore, because they already lived through the worst of it and came out tighter on the other side. This is what the foundation of a championship team looks like. Not just talent, not just highlight reels, but trust, hard-earned trust. So to the people who try to twist their story into something ugly, it's over. The narrative didn't stick. The truth won out, and it's louder than ever now. Let's be real. What Sydney Colson did wasn't just some emotional rant. It was calculated clarity. It was a reality check aimed directly at the people who've spent the last several months hoping the Indiana Fever would crumble under the weight of their own success. But the most uncomfortable truth she exposed, the so-called weight, never came from within. It came from them, from the veterans who couldn't handle a shift in attention, and from media outlets that cared more about engagement than accuracy. Let's talk about that media echo chamber for a second. It didn't start with reporting. It started with repeating. One veteran takes a swipe at Caitlin Clark, and suddenly every podcast, sports panel, and headline is echoing the same tired talking points. Is Clark dividing the locker room? Are veterans uncomfortable? Is Indiana imploding under pressure? And all the while, the actual players, the ones showing up every day, putting in the work, building their chemistry brick by brick, were watching their story get twisted into something they didn't even recognize. Sydney Colson finally stepped in and said what the rest of the team couldn't say publicly without it being turned into more controversy. She said it with full chest. This team isn't broken. Never was. In fact, it's the outside world that's been projecting dysfunction onto them, hoping something would stick. Let's be honest. There's a reason it hasn't. Because fake narratives eventually collapse when they run up against actual team culture. Not the curated kind. Not the we're all friends media day kind. The real thing. The kind that holds when the cameras are off, when someone goes down with an injury, when the team is losing 3 in a row and still shows up for each other. The kind of culture that can't be faked for a highlight reel. And that's what Indiana has. According to Colson, it's been there since day one. She talked about bonding that happened off the court. Those small, quiet moments that define whether a group of individuals becomes a team or not. Team dinners, long conversations, checking in. That's where chemistry is built. Not in scripted team-building exercises or surface-level interactions, but in the real stuff. And Colson made it clear, this team had it from the jump. The media didn't want that story. Because Fever shows healthy growth amid pressure doesn't get clicks like Clark divides locker room. And what's worse, every time someone on the team tried to offer a calm, reasoned response, it got buried under the noise. So Colson went louder. She met the mess with clarity. And let's talk about her perspective for a second. This isn't some rookie fresh out of college. This is a seasoned player who's seen how teams fall apart, how egos clash, and how toxic cultures look up close. She knows what a broken locker room feels like. She also knows what a strong one feels like. And she made it clear that Indiana's locker room, it's solid. She's not defending it because she has to. She's defending it because it's worth defending. Because what's happening behind closed doors is the complete opposite of what's been portrayed in the media. It's collaborative, it's supportive, and it's resilient. And yes, she defended Caitlin Clark, but not in some overprotective leave-her-alone way. She defended her because she's earned it. Because Clark, under all this ridiculous scrutiny, has continued to show up, put her head down, and work. She hasn't lashed out. She hasn't thrown blame. She hasn't tried to rewrite her own role. She's just adapted. Quietly. Consistently. Professionally. That's why she earned the respect of her teammates. Not because she came in as a star, but because she acted like a teammate. And that, more than anything, is what Colson was trying to get across. That none of this supposed dysfunction came from within. It was all noise. Manufactured to distract. Created by people who didn't want to share the spotlight. Because let's face it, Clark didn't just bring cameras. She brought a shift in visibility, and not everyone was ready for that. Some people would rather protect their past than contribute to the future. And when you're not ready to evolve, tearing others down becomes the fallback. Colson didn't name names, but the implication was loud enough. She called out a group of veterans who saw Clark's rise, and by extension, the Fevers, as a threat. Not because it took anything from them directly, but because it disrupted the ecosystem. It forced a new narrative. It brought fans who didn't know the old guard. And for some, that spotlight felt like it came at their expense. But what Colson made clear, again and again, is that the resentment was never coming from inside the Fever locker room. This team isn't divided. It's driven. They're not crumbling, they're climbing. And the people trying to make it look like otherwise, they've just been proven wrong. Because this team has endured the most intense microscope in the league and still found a way to bond. That doesn't happen without leadership. That doesn't happen without trust. That doesn't happen without players like Colson anchoring the culture when the pressure's highest. She didn't go public for drama. She went public to reclaim the story. And in doing so, she's flipped the narrative on its head. Because now, anyone trying to push that tired old dysfunction story has to go through her words first. And her words? They're grounded. They're firsthand. They're irrefutable. So where does this leave the Indiana Fever? Exactly where they were all along, focused, connected, unbothered. They've been tested by outside criticism, challenged by internal adversity, and pulled into narratives that never reflected their truth. And through it all, they've stayed solid. The spotlight isn't going anywhere. The scrutiny isn't going anywhere. And, probably, the jealousy isn't either. But after Colson's testimony, one thing is definitely gone: the credibility of the noise. So if you've been riding with the false headlines, it's time to switch lanes. If you've been convinced that the Fever are some fractured squad waiting to fall apart, Colson just handed you the receipts that prove otherwise. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Are you finally seeing through the media fog? Do you think other veterans will respond to Colson's honesty? And how much louder would these false narratives have gotten if she hadn't spoken up? Like if you're tired of watching teams get sabotaged by insecurity, share with someone who still thinks the Fever are just hype. And subscribe, because there's more truth coming, whether the league's ready for it or not.